Good morning, everyone. We are about to start our forum, and it's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce Ambassador Richard Bernal, who is also PVC for Global Affairs here at the University of the West Indies, and he's going to get us started with our program this morning. Ambassador, please.
Good morning, and welcome to the regional headquarters of the University of the West Indies. I want to begin by acknowledging Don Rojas, Special Advisor to the Vice-Chancellor. I acknowledge him especially because he was instrumental in putting this whole panel together on very short notice. My name is Richard Bernal. I'm the Pro Vice-Chancellor for Global Affairs. I'm standing in for the Vice-Chancellor this morning, who is chairing a meeting and therefore cannot excuse himself. But I hope that he'll be able to join us perhaps towards the end of the discussion. We look forward to his always insightful remarks. Pro Vice-Chancellors, members of the Diplomatic Corps, and I want to single out Ambassador Eleanor Felix, who is Director of Protocol in the Prime Minister's office, but I single her out because not only of our long friendship, but she was Jamaica's ambassador in Cuba during the years 2004 to 2009. We look forward to your participation in the discussion. Distinguished panelists, both here and by electronic means, we welcome you and thank you for agreeing to participate in this panel. Faculty, students, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to you here. I also want to extend a welcome to those who are joining us by live stream on UWI TV, and we hope that you'll be able to send in some questions and participate. The University of the West Indies, over its nearly 70 years of history, has always been an important forum for discussions of major issues, personalities, and events. These discussions have the advantage of being not only scholarly, but impartial. I mention that particularly given the topic we're going to discuss today, because there's been a lot of misinformation, a lot of ideologically motivated comments, and a lot of politically motivated comments. Here, we can be scholarly and impartial, and that is valuable, particularly in these days. This morning's seminar continues that tradition, and today we are focusing on the life and legacy of the late President of Cuba, Fidel Castro. It's not possible to do justice to the life of Fidel Castro in a few minutes or even in a panel discussion of an hour and a half or 2 hours. But we're making a start in what is going to be an ongoing discussion as we evaluate and assess his contribution and his life. I was very fortunate to have met him on a number of occasions and to have been in meetings with him, and he is genuinely charismatic and genuinely erudite. I digress briefly to say that when the CARICOM heads were in Cuba for the 30th anniversary of relations with Cuba, we had a meeting in the morning, and after lunch, one of our prime ministers, who will remain nameless, decided to ask the president about sugar. About 3 hours later, President Castro's assistant touched him and indicated that perhaps it was time to close the lunch. At that stage, he had only reached to the pre-revolutionary stage of the sugar industry. So he started with the plant, how it was introduced, who introduced it, who owned, and so on. I mean, we were disappointed in that we didn't get the full delivery, but time did not permit. But just a demonstration of his erudition and the kind of mastery of detail and history which he was capable of. He is important to us here in the Caribbean and globally because Fidel Castro devoted his life and his work to the betterment of the Cuban people, but beyond that, to the developing world. The vast majority of Cubans, I think, having been there on several occasions, genuinely love and revere him. And people all over the world respect him. They respect him because of two things. One, the social and political and economic goals which he believed in and advocated fearlessly. And secondly, his tangible policies of international solidarity. An integral part of that solidarity was that he was convinced of the validity and importance of a united Caribbean, regardless of the differences in language, the nuances of history, location, culture. He believed in a single Caribbean. And although Cuba was the largest country in the Caribbean, he never felt that that gave him a special role or a privileged position. He was one of the countries, and as you heard from the prime ministers of the Caribbean countries, they have had a very principled relationship supporting Cuba at difficult times, and Cuba has also done a great deal for the Caribbean, which is evident in the number of students who have benefited and also from the number of doctors who have been made available to countries in the region. His resistance to the dominant global superpower of the United States is legend. And even those that were more empathetic to the U.S. position had to grudgingly give the respect for his courage and tenacity. His internationalism, well known, manifested in so many different areas, for example in the non-aligned movement, and clearly evident on every issue, his advocacy and tangible support for self-determination, very important role that the Cubans played in Southern Africa, evident in anti-colonial struggles, and evident in the striving for economic independence, to seek alternative models, particularly for developing countries. He changed Cuba from a decadent plantation society ruled by a series of dictators and a playground for the rich. At his time of his death, he could point to a country which provided full employment, free education, and free comprehensive health care to all its citizens. The social indicators achieved by Cuba are on par and in some cases exceed those achieved in developed countries. No one is perfect. He made errors and he had his critics. The critics complain about not having two-party democracy and not having a private sector. But his record of the quality of life provided to the citizens stands scrutiny. In fact, the recent report on the Caribbean development indicates clearly that those indicators are extremely favorable. And they go beyond the standard ones. If you look at life expectancy, you look at nutrition levels, and solving certain illnesses which are particularly prevalent in the region. Fidel Castro is indelibly etched in world history for his ideals, leadership, courage, and his commitment to social change. An important and often overlooked fact is that he made strenuous efforts to eliminate any racial prejudice in access to education in Cuba, in access to jobs, etc. His example will continue to inspire all of those who are committed to a better world for mankind. Whether his life was an episode or his legacy will be preserved is something I leave to the more qualified persons on the panel. Speaking of the panel, I think we are indeed extremely fortunate, and I'm not trespassing on the chairman's turf, but I would like to make a brief comment why I think we are so fortunate with this panel. First of all, we have with us Ambassador and High Commissioner Derrick Heaven, former Minister of State in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, with particular focus on working with socialist countries. He was also a member of Parliament. He was Minister of Industry and Commerce, etc. But why mention him in particular is that, as you know, I have some exposure to diplomatic activity. So I feel quite qualified to make the following statement. And I'm sure after the panel he will tell me I went too far. But I want to go on record as saying that over the years he's one of the most astute and skilled diplomats I have met, and I have been in the game for about much longer than I'd like to record here. Secondly, we have Professor Franklin Knight, Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. He has been studying, visiting, working, interacting with Cuba for, and I know this will embarrass him, for probably close to 40 years. I know his youthful demeanor seems to give question to that, but he is easily one of the top experts on Latin America and Cuba, and I can tell you his knowledge is encyclopedic. Whenever I speak to him, I always come away wiser. I realize my status is still that of student, but it's a happy status. We are very happy to have Dr. Anika McFarlane with us, who studied medicine in Cuba, and I'm sure she'll have some fascinating anecdotes and facts to tell us. Having abused the privilege of speaking first and trespassing beyond my remit, Mr. Chairman, it only remains for me to introduce the chairman himself. Here again, I think we're very fortunate. Professor Matthew Smith is head of the Department of History and Archaeology. He is justly renowned for his books on Haiti, but he's also somebody who has followed Caribbean and Cuban affairs very closely. And I'm very happy to say he's going to handle the difficult task of how to manage this panel. With that said, I would like to again welcome all of you. Look forward to this very exciting and informative panel, and to thank you for your attendance. I've been charged with some housekeeping matters. I unfortunately have to announce that the second panel of today's doubleheader has been postponed. That panel was on the Grenada referendum on including whether Grenada should be a member of the Caribbean Court of Justice. We have postponed it because we think that it might be overload. Both of these are such important topics. We've decided to separate them. That means that the panel has more time, Mr. Chairman. Speaking of time, I certainly have taken more time than I was anticipated. So again, welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much, PVC Bernal. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. A special welcome to members of the Diplomatic Corps, representatives from Venezuela here and others. Welcome to my panelists, those sitting beside me, and also to Professor Knight there, who, good to see you on TV, frankly, if not in person. We hope to have a very rich discussion this morning on Fidel Castro's life and legacy. Cubans and their sisters and brothers across the Americas woke up to the shocking headline: Fidel Castro is dead. This news reached them on today's date, December 5, 60 years ago. The news had first been published in the local Cuban papers by the Batista regime and then picked up by UPI and circulated to all major outlets. It even reached the papers here in Jamaica. Fidel Castro, the bold 30-year-old revolutionary who had left Cuba 2 years before, vowing to come back to remove Batista. Fidel Castro, that young man who in Mexican exile had attracted a significant following of loyalists there as well as in Cuba, who the Cuban press were already calling Fidelistas. Fidel Castro, who in the reports was said to have led a band of guerrillas that had arrived on a boat and were shot by Batista's soldiers when they arrived. That's, of course, the grandma. That Fidel Castro was said to have died. But we know, of course, Fidel Castro was not dead. Fidel was one of the few survivors of that onslaught when they arrived from the grandma and the attack. Indeed, Fidel was left in a cane field, the Alegria de Pio, where he lay quietly hidden on the leaves with two other of his comrades, Universo Sanchez and Faustina Perez. Knowing the likelihood that Batista's soldiers would be searching the cane field for them, they spoke only in whispers. And it's also said that they had ulcers in their mouths because they were eating the sugar cane, no food around them, and they had to strip the cane with their teeth and hands. They only had 2 guns among them, and at night they slept on their backs with the guns slung over their chests, staring out of the cane piece at the stars. Universo actually said later on that Fidel slept with the barrel to his head, saying that if any soldier came up and saw him, he would not give them the benefit of taking him in alive. His mantra at the time, which he would repeat frequently to his 2 comrades to encourage them, is, "We will be free or we will be martyrs." In their hushed conversation, Castro talked endlessly about victory. He shocked them. He said, "We will be victorious. We will win this revolution. We will also have a new Cuba." He went on about Jose Marti, Cuban history, and the sort of society he envisioned for Cuba after they won the revolution. Now, much of what followed next is now very well known to us. Castro, Sanchez, and Perez would crawl through the cane field and make their way to the foot of the Sierra Maestra, where they regrouped with the other survivors. From there, they would launch their monumental revolution. But there are 2 things about this initial experience that are important for us to consider. Fidel Castro was an extraordinarily brave man with a remarkable ability to inspire those around him. And that even when the odds were clearly stacked against him, he held strong to his vision of a new Cuba. This new Cuba, as was evident in his hundreds of pages of broad-sized manifestos, articles, and lectures that he had given prior to this event in 1956, was not simply going to be an erosion of Batista rule, but, as he once wrote, an entire change from top to bottom. Fidel Castro believed himself firmly to have history on his side. Already his revolutionary vision had the makings of a powerfully transformative force that would not only affect Cuba's destiny, but impact the Americas and beyond. Today, 6 days after the Sierra Maestra campaign started and after Fidel Castro has been brought to his final resting place, we must take measure of this incredible scope of his vision and the transformations he brought to the world. Our forum this morning will critically examine Fidel's life, career, legacy, and I should add, following on Ambassador Bernal, impartially examine his contributions and his extraordinary personality. I would like now to to give a few more opening remarks on our panelists and introduce them in the order that they will speak. Each panelist will have about 5 minutes to give opening remarks, and thereafter we will go into discussion. Our first speaker is Ambassador Derrick Heaven, former Executive Chairman of the Sugar Industry Authority and appointed as the new chairman of directors of the Jamaica cane products sales. And of course, Richard Bernal, Ambassador Bernal, had given us some of his background, and we are very, very pleased to have him on the panel. He has served as the chairman of the International Sugar Organization, and his tenure in public life includes serving as Jamaica's first resident ambassador to Japan and also as High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. After Ambassador Heaven, we will hear from Professor Knight, who is Leonard and Helen Stallman Professor Emeritus and Academy Professor at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, where he has taught for over 40 years. He has published widely on the social, cultural, economic, and political dimensions of Latin America and Caribbean, and is indeed one of the leading specialists, academic specialists on Cuban history. Our third panelist is Dr. Anika McFarlane, a Jamaican graduate of the Mariana Grajales Latin American School of Medicine in Cuba, and she completed her studies in 2008, and she will give us comments on her experience in Cuba, as well as her thoughts on Fidel Castro. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome all panelists. We'll begin with Ambassador Heaven.
Can I sit here?
Yes.
Thank you very much. It is indeed a pleasure to participate in this function, which is long overdue. And it's unfortunate that we had to await the passing of President Castro for something like this to be called, so that the tradition that had developed in Jamaica about things relating to Cuba, unfortunately, had been seen only in partisan terms. And I think it is time, in order to bring a level of objectivity to the relationship, that we look at the events and analyze them for what they're worth, because unfortunately I see evolving a new set of Jamaicans whose interpretation of events in the relationship between Jamaica and Cuba is skewed entirely almost along partisan lines. Things have started to change somewhat, but I think it's important in the, is it 5 minutes?
No.
In the time allotted, I would like to look very briefly at his international stance. I would like also to look at how that related to events in Jamaica and the impact and influence it had on us. Cuba's role in the international arena, but particularly its role in Africa, somehow is underplayed and has not received the level of prominence it deserves. And the way in which the role of Cuba in Africa, at great sacrifice to Cuba, has changed events in Africa, particularly in Southern Africa, but not only in Southern Africa, in Ethiopia and several other countries in Africa. How has that affected us in Jamaica? The support that Cuba needed for its stance in Africa came a lot from Jamaica, political support, at also great sacrifice to Jamaica. Indeed, a very senior person in the U.S. administration at the time was very concerned about Jamaica's continued support for Cuba's role in Southern Africa, and that needs to be put in context. When Angola received its independence from Portugal, 1975, Angola had developed the reputation of being a haven for a lot of revolutionary movements in Angola. particularly the ANC, and the South Africans were very concerned that if that was allowed to continue, that their existence would be jeopardized. And so in 1975, I think it was, they decided to mount a massive military incursion into Angola, aimed at ensuring that these revolutionaries, so-called, would be once and for all eliminated. But at the same time, if you look at the geography, you will see that they were also concerned about being encircled, not only by Angola, but by Mozambique, and also what was happening in Namibia. When they went into Angola, the Angolan Prime Minister went on the air and appealed to the world for help, because the South African forces were well armed and were going into Angola to do one thing only, which is to subdue and bring under control, under its own control, Angola. One country responded, Cuba. At a time when the Cubans were in serious discussions with the United States about rapprochement. And they were warned that if they went into Angola, it would have jeopardized the discussions that were taking place. They still mounted a force of about 40,000. And they went in, and the rest is history. Well, they drove the South Africans out of Angola up to the South African border and were prevailed on not to go into South Africa itself. And this was done at great sacrifice to the Cuban and the Cuban people themselves, to the extent that that particular action brought about independence in Namibia and brought an end to apartheid in South Africa. And I always recall, I think I was in London at the time when President Mandela was being sworn in. And when Fidel Castro entered that stadium, he got a standing ovation from everybody, and it was acknowledged the role that he played in bringing about the end of apartheid, but in also influencing a lot of the other liberation struggles that were taking place at the time, including Zimbabwe even. And I must say, without being partisan, that the role of Jamaica in giving the political support that was needed to Cuba to be able to do this cannot be underestimated, to the extent that Jamaica was warned and threatened that if it didn't refrain and stop giving that support, it would suffer the consequences. And indeed, things did happen significantly that caused Jamaica also to suffer from. I will stop here because I really want to also say something about the role of Cuba in assisting us. There are a number of areas in which we received significant assistance. Part of what in the 70s was at an objective of the government was to widen our contacts away from traditional partners. Not that we were now making enemies of traditional friends, but we thought that it was in our best interest to be able to deal with some other people. The Cubans provided us with valuable advice about many of the other opportunities that existed with Venezuela, with the Soviet Union, with Comecon. And I happen to have had the privilege and opportunity of being the leader of the first official delegation from Jamaica to the Soviet Union. There were five of us. 3 have since departed. Norman Gervan, Louis Lindsay, John Pickersgill, myself, and Winston Gooden, who was an officer in the Jamaican High Commissioner in London at the time. And the type of advice that the Cubans gave us would surprise some of you in this audience if I was to repeat all of them. Very practical, very down to earth, in advising how to deal with the Soviet Union that they have been dealing with for such a long time. And let me tell you that evolved as part of the propaganda was that Jamaica was becoming a communist state, and that the party that formed the government at the time was bent on becoming, adopting the role of communists. Nothing could be further from the truth. But however, it serves to justify certain actions. Since communists were people who had horns and ate babies, then once you are labeled as such, then anything that happens to you is justified. I think it's something that it's very difficult to convince Jamaicans that this was not inevitable and that we were bent on becoming another satellite of the Soviet Union in the Caribbean. I think that if I could just turn quickly to some of the things that, apart from the international arena, that we benefited from as a country because of the direct involvement of President Castro, who I also had the opportunity of meeting on 1 or 2 occasions. And I particularly remember a particular occasion when myself and 2 other colleagues from Jamaica met with him and 2 other persons at a meeting that started at midnight one night. And something that occurred in the last few days that has brought home to me what was a focal point of the discussion we were having with him, in that he was advocating how important it was that the personality cult should be discouraged. And he spoke at great length, and he called the names of some world leaders, which I won't repeat, who had run afoul of their own citizens because they had become cultists rather than dealing with the revolution. And you'll be surprised at some of the names that he called. But one notes that at his funeral, his brother indicated that they wouldn't be naming any streets after him and they wouldn't be doing a lot of things because of his fear for being branded as a cultist. I think this is very important because it's easy for us to fall prey to the propaganda of the day without understanding what was in the mind of this person. When in early 1970s we decided and accepted the generosity of the Cubans with the Cuban doctors, the first thing that happened in Sablama was a major demonstration led by some local doctors, including one very prominent local doctor who became a very senior person in the party of the day, who protested about the Cuban doctors coming here to help to spread communism and to be in competition with the local doctors. And there were all sorts of things that emanated from that move, which still prevails today, not only in terms of the exchange of doctors coming here, but also in the training of many of our young people in medicine, which was badly needed. And Cuba has had the reputation of having one of the finest healthcare systems in the world, certainly one of the lowest infant mortality rates, and you could go on and on. Similarly with education, almost the elimination of illiteracy. And so we benefited significantly from a flow of that thought in terms of doctors and nurses that came here, but also in terms of education, given the number of schools that were built. And we also have had a situation where a lot of young men in particular, and latterly young women, who were sent to Cuba to be part of construction brigades. I was in charge of that in its initial stage. I went to Cuba with the first brigade that went to Alamar to build an apartment building. The second brigade went to Camagüey to build a hotel in Santa Lucia. I can state categorically that contrary to rumors and propaganda, that no member of any of those construction brigades went to Cuba to learn how to shoot guns. But it is something that has been so inculcated in people's head that sometimes I just sit by and listen to some of what is being said about the brigade. I was at a gas station a few weeks ago, and a gentleman drove up in his Mercedes-Benz, and he said to me, "So you don't remember me, sir?" So I said, "No, help me out now." He says, "I was a brigadista, sir." But so I said to him, "What are you doing now?" He says, "I'm building shopping centers for rent." And so the skills level acquired by some of these people had absolutely nothing to do with military action, but it facilitated the propaganda of the day and served as yet another means of discrediting Cuba. I learned some things when Fidel came to Jamaica that it opened a lot of people's eyes, and the whole issue of security and how, notwithstanding 600 attempts at his life, he died peacefully at age 90 in bed. And I think it is something for us to recognize. Both our leaders at the time were great sportsmen, or loved sports. And I have to, before I close, just mention that G.C. Foster College. Hugh Small, who was Minister of Sports at the time, himself, and Cedric McCulloch, who was the Permanent Secretary. I was chair in the Joint Commission. I went to Cuba at Michael Manley's instructions to conclude negotiations on a physical education college. And I remember when we came back, Prime Minister sent and called us immediately and said he would prefer if the school could be placed in Kingston. The only problem is that the school required about 50 or 60 acres of land, And it is at that time when you looked at the map of Kingston, you realized there is no open space in Kingston apart from Legany Club and I think one or two holdings by the Water Commission and Hope Gardens. As Member of Parliament in Spanish Town, I volunteered for the Aragonaba lands which was lying idle to be used. And I must say, enough credit is not being given to the history of that school. It was built by a Cuban brigade and a brigade from my constituency. That's how it was built. The fact of that school and its impact on sports has been enormous, particularly sports in rural Jamaica, where a lot of the graduates have gone out into rural Jamaica, and you can see the difference. When I was at high school, everything was centered around in Kingston, and I come from country, I went to Cornwall. And although we had good sportsmen, nobody, it's only the JCs and others. But I think it's important for us to understand how we benefited from the relationship and how possibly during the discussion period I could add more. But I think that we need now to shy away from this reluctance to discuss the relationship for fear of being labeled as being partisan. Happily, one notes a change, and we see the divide being narrowed. And indeed, Fidel's words that history will absolve him has already started. Thank you.
Thank you.
You run the risk of lessening its distinction by including me, but nevertheless I will proceed. And then I want to say that it's almost impossible to render an appreciation of Fidel Castro and the Castro Revolution in 5 minutes. So I'll give you some bullet points. Let me begin by continuing what I think Ambassador Bernal started very well, which is to say that there were qualities, individual qualities in Fidel Castro that made him distinguished not just locally in Cuba or regionally in the Caribbean, but internationally. And I would say that these had to do with his principles and his qualities of a sense of Cuban history, a strong sense of Cuban history, a strong sense of Cuban reality, and a strong sense of the relationship, the historical relationship between Cuba and the United States, which of course preceded the independence of the United States. So I think if we want to talk about Fidel Castro, we have to talk about Fidel Castro as a revolutionary. But if we want to do that, we have to begin by defining what we mean by a revolution and how a revolutionary is different from someone who changes a government. I would say in the history of the modern world, there have only been 7 significant revolutions. And I say this because I define a revolution as a fundamental change in the social basis of political power. So if we use that as a working definition, there aren't a lot of political changes that measure up to this. I would say these would include the United States, but this is a marginal revolution. It did not change the fundamental basis of political power. I would say it included the French Revolution because the French Revolution created the sense of nationalism, which was to be a fundamental part of every subsequent true revolution. I would say included the Haitian Revolution, which in the history of revolution is the most revolutionary of all, as Professor Smith has demonstrated so well. I would say it included the Mexican Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and Cuba is the seventh revolution. All the others are approximations to revolutions in the sense that they did not fulfill that precondition of changing fundamentally the social basis of political power. So when we look at the Cuban Revolution, we have to begin by saying that this was not a stagnant and static event. This was a process of change that started in the early 1960s and evolved. And the leadership that Fidel gave to this, not just by himself, but by the inner circle as well, was critical until the present time. Because everyone predicted that this is a revolution that could not exist without the presence of Fidel. And it managed to do that. And as Professor Smith has shown, that premature obituaries of Fidel and his revolution are legion. So let us look at what's going to happen to Cuba now that part of the Castro system has gone to a higher plane. First, I think we have to look at the present reality. I said that Cuba was sensitive to the relationship with the United States. And the United States, at this critical moment, will still continue to play a very important role in Cuba. But the United States of 2016 is not the United States of 1958 or 1959 or 1776 or any of the other dates that you might select. So what we find in the new Cuba, and I think that in a very significant way Fidel Castro prepared Cubans to this, was that Cuba became global before it was fashionable to be global. And I would say that not only was Cuba global before it was fashionable to be global, but that Cuba had some characteristics in its history which made it exceptional. This is a phrase historians like to use a lot. But when I think of Cuban exceptionalism, it relates to geography, political culture, and economic culture. So you have to look at the location in the days of sailorship of where Cuba is, that it was the key location in both entering the Americas and leaving the Americas. And that's why Havana played that important role as the sort of warehouse for bullion before it was shipped to Europe. And what that made of Havana was that it was more than just another American fortified port city. It became a cosmopolitan city. And that is reflected in the Cuban culture today. Very few people realize that in 1790, when we started first making censuses, that Cuba, Havana, the city of Havana, was the third largest city in the Western Hemisphere, after Mexico City and Lima, Peru. That the city of Havana was more than twice the size of the largest city in the United States at that time. In fact, almost 4 times the size of New York City. Havana had about 90,000 people. Havana had 38,000 people. But I have to telescope things, but one aspect of Cuba and Havana that is exceptional in the history of the Caribbean, almost in the history of the Americas, is that a lot of the sugar wealth that was generated in the era of the sugar revolutions remained in Cuba. If you look at Jamaica or Barbados or Suriname or any other country, that was repatriated to Europe. Havana acquired so much wealth that it not only could pay for its own railroad, and apart from the United States, there is no other country that paid for the construction of its own railroads, and the railroads came to Cuba after the United States, 4 years after, the second country to make railroads. 17 years before its metropolis built a railroad. Cuba built a railroad to promote its sugar export. Spain built a railroad to transport the royal family on holidays. Different priorities. The second thing about Cuba is that partly because of this economic importance in the 19th century, it developed a marketing mentality, a consumer mentality, which is exceptional in the history of Latin America and the Caribbean. And one could say almost on par with the United States. So part of that relationship between Cuba and the United States is the similarity of material culture that permeates them. And this is an aspect that Fidel really appreciated. Let me briefly say what I hope the panel will discuss. I hope we will discuss some of the present realities and incongruities between the position of Cuba and the perception of Cuba promoted by external press and media, and what Cuba has done to address these domestically. I hope we will look at the obstacles to what one might say is the love-hate relationship. Wayne Smith called it the closest of enemies between Cuba and the United States, and how that can be reconciled in the changing political circumstances of both countries. And I hope that other issues, such as the domestic politics constructed by the revolutionary government, can continue to perpetuate itself even in a non-revolutionary way. All revolutions end. And how, in fact, Cuba will remain, because it has been, Caribbean and Latin American in this process of intensive globalization that is our present reality. I think I will stop there. I hope I have not abused your ears too much, and I hope I can participate a little more in the future discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Knight. Dr. McFarlane? Anika.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I had went to Cuba for the first time as a student in September 2001. That was immediately after the 9/11. I'm sure everyone would remember that event. And it was after receiving a scholarship which was made possible through a bilateral agreement between the Jamaican and Cuban governments. I was very elated to have received this scholarship, as it was a golden opportunity for me to pursue my dream of studying medicine without having to be a burden to my family. As you all know, the worry of having to pay expensive tuition fees, etc. Considering that at the time, we were very young students just arriving from various countries, we did not know much Spanish, honestly speaking. I mean, I personally, I had learned, I would call it basic Spanish at CXC level, and it's nothing compared to living in a country where the people speak Spanish, and at the rate they speak Spanish, it is faster than CXC level. I mean, CXC is like baby Spanish. I'm being honest. Hence, we all had to do a one-year preparatory course where we were taught Spanish by our Cuban teachers. Now, you can just imagine this was a very unique experience for all of us on many levels, as you was literally submerged in the Cuban culture, so you had no other choice but to learn the Spanish language. For example, if you wanted to go to use a public bathroom or to go to the market to purchase food items or gum provisions or to find directions to a particular store or bakery, you just had to learn the Spanish. So in earlier periods when we just arrived, we used to have the habit of walking around with our dictionaries in our bags. Yes, in a laugh. Walking around with our dictionaries in our bags, just in case if there was a phrase or word we might forget, so that we could be able to kind of fill in the gaps of what we wanted to say to the people in the streets. Sometimes when they still didn't understand us, we had to use on-the-spot made-up sign language like pointing and everything to express what we wanted to say. But after a while, little by little, we learned the language and soon abandoned the need to work with our dictionaries. Interestingly, in addition to learning to speak Spanish, many of us also learn to speak Cubano. And you may wonder, what is Cubano? Cubano is the Cuban dialect of the Spanish language. It's similar to when persons from overseas will come to Jamaica. They think they can speak to Jamaicans if they know English, but it's not so it goes. We also have another language here called Patois, Jamaican Patois. So it's the same reverse in Cuba. Just don't think that because you know how to speak Spanish, you can just go to Cuba and speak to anyone there. Some persons, they just love to speak, not that they don't speak Spanish, you know, but they love to speak the Cubano. So being there in Cuba, it was like a cultural melting pot on many levels and in many respects. I had the opportunity to meet many friends who I still keep in contact with through Facebook and other social media contacts from various countries of the world. And this is not just limited to my friends from Cuba alone, but I also met persons from various Caribbean countries such as the Bahamas, Barbados, Antigua, Trinidad and Tobago, Bermuda, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Guyana, St. Kitts and Nevis, as well as from India, Mali, South Africa, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, South America, Principe, Ethiopia, and also some Latin American countries such as Panama, Chile, Mexico, Venezuela. And this is just to name a few countries. And the great thing about this experience was that we not only saw and interacted with each other in the classroom setting, but at the same time, while living on the dorms, we also interacted with each other on a personal level and formed strong bonds of friendship, as well as shared ideas and stories about what it was like living in each other's countries. I even had the wonderful experience of sampling various different types of meals and cuisines prepared by my friends from Cuba and their other different countries. As well as, in all due fairness, when I prepared my Jamaican meals, I would share it with them as well. And I must admit, they all loved our Jamaican food. My time in Cuba was a very rewarding experience on many levels. It has taught me to be very open-minded, not only to a new culture, but also to a new way of lifestyle. It also taught me to appreciate the little things in life and be grateful for what I have in my own personal life. This concept and experience has not only influenced me in my personal life, but also guided me in my daily work as a medical doctor, and in turn influenced me on how I deal with my patients and fellow colleagues. The Cuban experience also taught me to be resilient in many ways. I have the utmost respect and appreciation for the Cuban people. I am amazed at how the people of Cuba are able to use the little what they have and make something grand out of it. I also learned the importance of not wasting anything, no matter how small it is. And I also learned how to appreciate people for who they are and to just love them just the same. Another important thing that I learned is that I learned the importance of discipline in a society and how a disciplined society can help in the advancement and improvement of a nation. As you are aware, the Cuban people have many strides in many areas of life, including the pharmaceutical industry, just to name one example, but I could continue on. And this is due to the fact that the people of Cuba have a certain character about them which makes them unique, and that involves the love for their country and their discipline and willingness to serve their country. So I have to stick within the time limit, so I can't continue on, but I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about my experience in Cuba.
Thank you very much, Dr. McFarlane, and thanks again to all three panelists for their opening comments. Now, I think a lot has been laid on the table by our panelists, some very important issues. We see some overlap. A key theme that of course, we hope to get into some more dialogue about is what will happen in Cuba now. As Professor Knight mentioned, the United States of 2016 is not the United States of the late 1950s. What does that mean for Cuban-U.S. relations going forward? But to frame some of those contemporary issues, which I know are very, very present in our minds, I would like to start by asking Professor Knight, just going back to his idea of Cuban exceptionalism, Professor Knight, and returning as well to the person of Fidel Castro. How exceptional was Castro at the time of his coming of age? If you could kind of elaborate a little bit for us on the context of Cuba during the period when Fidel Castro became politically mature.
Yeah, I think that's a really very good observation. And let me begin by saying that when I speak of exceptionalism, I'm not using the term lightly or loosely. Cuban exceptionalism derives a lot from the fact that of all modern societies, Cuba is the only one I know of, and I could go into this a lot, that actually demonstrated a sense of nationalism before it had a political state. Not the United States, not Mexico, not Argentina, not Bolivar's Venezuela did that. They created the state, then they formed a nation. In fact, this is the achievement, which I hinted at earlier, of Napoleon in France. Creating the state and then mobilizing the nation behind it. The second aspect is that this sense of Cuban history and importance is something Cubans shared for over 100 years before their independence. The educational system in Cuba was far advanced of that of Spain from the 1790s onwards. And again, if any of you are in the educational field, you will realize this. The University of Havana, one of the oldest in the hemisphere, in 1728, was already emphasizing science and technology in the 1790s, when in Spain it was still humanism and law. If we again looked at the role that Jose Marti, trained by Cuban scholars, developed, and it is not a coincidence that Fidel is always allying himself to Jose Marti, and that Jose Marti is the symbol shared both by Cubans in Cuba and by Cubans wherever they are outside of Cuba, because he was the first to mobilize this sense in Cuba that the nation, not just the state of Cuba, which was not in existence at the time, the nation warranted the devotion that transcended any of the internal divisions of class and race. And this is what permeated the sensibility of Fidel Castro. And I think that it explains the African campaign, it explains the attitude to the rest of Latin America, and it explains internationalism. Fidel never asked his country, what's the price we're going to pay for this? He says this has to be done because it is part of our humanity. And I think this is why Fidel symbolizes so much in the wider world. The second thing that I would say about this is that for a student of his time, Fidel was not exceptional. He was very smart, that we know. He was very focused. He had this great mind. But if you look at others who did not unfortunately live as long as he did, Che Guevara shared some of these. Camilo Cienfuegos shared a lot of these. And in fact, I would say even someone who was not all the way a revolutionary to that degree, Uber Matas, but a lot of the young men of the 90s who came to maturity in the late 1930s and 1940s were shaped by the changes in Latin America in university education, beginning in Argentina in 1919 and going through across Latin America. And that was the construction of the independent university cities, University of Buenos Aires, and the second one was the University of Havana on this new campus where it is today. And what the independent university did was to inculcate in students that they were almost like a state within a state. They had responsibilities to the wider state, but they had certain autonomous privileges, one of which was that the police could not enter the campus without being invited by the rector, something that Batista consistently abused and led to part of the university resistance against Batista in the 1950s. The concept of communal that Dr. McFarlane spoke about, of communal responsibility, that is a consequence of the independent university thinking. And you can see it again in Cuba, you can see it in Mexico, you can see it in Buenos Aires, and it comes later to Chile and some of the other countries. But it is a part of that new generation at the middle of the 20th century that begun to reevaluate their countries in these intensely and idealistically nationalist terms.
Thank you very much. You know, one of the things hearing you speak, Professor Knight, that I was thinking through was the issue of what was happening in the mid-20th century elsewhere in the Caribbean. And thinking back to Ambassador Heaven's presentation about the so-called brigadista connections with Cuba and Jamaica at the time, but going just a bit further back, looking at the period of our independence, decolonization happening in parts of the Caribbean, of course, the change of governments in many places. It's quite striking that in that 5-year period between 56 going into about the early 60s, I mean, you have independence in Jamaica, Trinidad, you have the coming to power of the Duvalier dictatorship in Haiti, you have Eric Williams. So much is happening. I'm very curious, Ambassador Heaven, perhaps you could explain for me what the attitudes were with, say, our government at that time, before we get to the period of the 1970s, toward Cuba and toward ideas about involving Cuba more in our concept of the Caribbean, as Cuba tried to, as Ambassador Bernal said, develop more this one Caribbean idea.
Strange enough, the fact that on a clear day in Negril you could see Cuba.
Yeah.
This is a fact. The sort of recognition and involvement in what is happening in Cuba was not really a priority for us in Jamaica. And I would say throughout the Caribbean that the role of Cuba under Batista, the role of the mafia being in charge of affairs in Cuba at the time, and even the significance of the way in which black people were being treated, didn't arouse the sort of passion in Jamaica at the time, the era you speak about. And it was not until the early 1970s that Cuba became an issue with us, positively or negatively. And I think that it's an important question as to why not. Being so close to us, why was it that at that time it didn't evoke the sort of reaction that one would have thought possible? Significantly, I just returned from London 2 days ago, attending a conference in London, an International Sugar. And there was a Cuban delegation there that presented their plans for sugar going forward. And significantly, it was very interesting to see that far from being dead, sugar is going to be seen as an important contributor going forward. Hitherto, and particularly in the era that we speak about, our contact with Cuba was more with Jamaicans who had gone to Cuba to cut cane. And there is in fact quite a contingent there. And so that what prevailed at the time between ourselves and Cuba was more to talk about ancestry and who was in Cuba at the time. But there was nothing political, and there was nothing that had any relationship to projects between both countries. And it was not until when Jamaica established relations with Cuba that the intensity of the relationship developed. And so I would say that that period you speak about, very little happened to interact, notwithstanding the fact that we were able to see parts of Cuba physically from Jamaica.
Thank you. That brings us also to, oh, sure.
I would like to expand a little on the ambassador's statement. And I would like to, first of all, contextualize it. We have to realize that we're talking about a period which precedes the independence of the British West Indian Islands,
right,
or territories. And what is overshadowing everything at that time is the developing Cold War. And one has to see the neglect of, say, on part of Jamaica, not by all Jamaicans. I went to Calabar High School. I was taught by Spanish teachers from Cuba at the time. And part of my attraction to Cuba and Cubans derives from the fact that Senora Ula was such a divine apparition in an all-boys school. But if you are a colony, you do not control the mechanism of media. And that was what Jamaica and the British West Indies suffered for. So that it's not just that we didn't know about Cuba, we didn't know a lot about Barbados or Trinidad or Guyana. But don't forget that when we look at the Cuban Revolution, we tend to link it to the overthrow of our Benz in Guatemala in 1954. But actually, that's not the first bad Caribbean business done by the CIA. That was, in fact, 1951 in Guyana and 1953 in Guyana. And we have the whole relationship with Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which could use the U.S. or communist card usefully right up until the 60s. So what we have is Great Britain playing a subordinate role to the United States, and the United States constructing this media blitz against places or people it didn't like. The Jagans in Guyana, communists. They overlooked the Cuban Revolution, I think, only because it was an election year in the United States. Had that not been so, Fidel would have been overdone. I might also say that the CIA has a particularly undistinguished record of achievement in anything it attempts, and Cuba was lucky in that regard.
Thank you very much, Professor Knight. Let me ask a question of Anika and bring her into the conversation. Thinking about this connection again between Jamaica and Cuba, what were the perceptions, of Jamaicans who went with you to Cuba, of Cubans at the time? Did you find that the experience that Professor Knight and Ambassador have now talked about from that, especially from the period of the 1970s, had sort of affected how people going to Cuba, Jamaicans going to Cuba thought, and how much of that was dispelled when they arrived?
You're right. When you're here in Jamaica, there's one perception, but you never know the true perception until you have been in the fire or in the pot. If you, just to use a terminology what people use, meaning that unless you have been there and experienced it for yourself, you cannot develop a true perception of what things are. I'm not going to say that everything is perfect, but I will be honest to say that, yes, there was mixed reviews on that plane ride coming over from Jamaica the first time when all of us came over and landed in the airport together for the first time. But then as time went by and we got integrated into the culture and we all learned what was really happening, the views began to change and we realized, and in the end, we have the utmost respect for the Cuban people and for the Honorable Fidel Castro as a leader. There are many things that we would love that our own countries would adopt as well. As I mentioned before, the discipline of a society and how people working together, it don't matter whether you're from this party or that party or whatever, this part of Jamaica or that part of Jamaica or this country, or, you know, working together to make the nation move forward and advance. And that is something that the Cuban people has taught us a lot, over and over. And we see it in many examples. I can name many right now, but time won't permit. But that is one strong thing that I've learned.
Okay. Thank you. Thinking also of kind of going a bit on the chronology of Cuban history here, thinking further closer to our time, which is the special period and the way that impacted Cuba as well as Castro's reputation at the time. I'm wondering if Ambassador Heaven may have a few thoughts on that. On the special period after the fall of the Soviet Union.
It particularly had a devastating effect on the economy. One of the things that, and there are some similarities to our own situation, Cuba was receiving from the Soviet Union one of the highest prices for sugar in the world. Based on the relationship, in return they were receiving oil, energy, and so this sudden removal of this relationship caused significant economic difficulty for the Cuban people. And when you went to Cuba during that period, you realized that most other countries in the world would have been able to withstand the impact of the devastation in that special period, were it not for the level of preparation that had gone into getting the people some of the things that Dr. Alluded to, for them to understand what was happening. Because one of the things that was fundamental was political education in Cuba, which is misinterpreted to mean propaganda in its negative connotation. But it prepared the Cubans for being able to cope with this special period. And this is why, my own personal opinion, that those people in, say, Miami who are salivating at the thought of what is now open to them to come back to resume the lifestyle that existed during Batista's days, I think they would be in for some surprises, because they will find a country that thinks a little differently and would not be prepared to allow what they would regard as slipping back into the dark days when they didn't have, when illiteracy reigned, when healthcare was a premium. And so there are things that they can point to which I suspect that they would resist any opportunity of going back into those days. Now, one of the things that I think is sometimes not sufficiently emphasized is that the Cuban people have been undergoing an embargo. And the embargo is not just an embargo based on shortage of goods and that sort of thing. It is also a little emphasized bill passed in the United States Congress called the Helms-Burton Bill, which made it illegal for any country to literally be dealing with Cuba. And I recall, as a leading hotelier in Jamaica, found out that by attempting to do business with the acquisition of a hotel in Cuba meant that he couldn't get a visa to go to the United States. So we have to look at the way in which things evolved on them to understand why certain actions were taken internally. And I'm not trying to justify everything that happened, but it is by way of allowing us to understand why. I just shudder to think how Jamaica would react to an embargo like that.
Yeah. Well, and that has been a major feature, of course, that of Cuba's relationship with the United States that has been quite devastating from the beginning, really, of the early part of the revolution. But the element you spoke of, Ambassador, of Cuban-U.S. relations, particularly with the Cuban Americans and Cuban exile population in the United States, is a very, very important one. And it goes all the way back, as Professor Knight was mentioning earlier, to the 19th century, if not earlier than that, actually. But I wonder, Professor Knight, what do you think will be the response of Cuban Americans going forward? There's this initial sort of outpouring, and we read it in the media, and we see the images on TV of celebrations and a lot of articles being highly critical of Castro. But what really will be the space that they will occupy in Cuba in the near future?
Well, you're asking me to prophesy.
Oh, sorry.
Historians are not very good at that.
Yes, based on experience.
Yeah. But let me begin by talking about the embargo.
Yeah.
Now, I've been to Cuba 6 or 7 times since 1977. I've run all over Cuba from Vinales to Santiago. And I just don't speak with the upper classes or the political classes alone. I'm in bars, I am in the street, I speak to the ordinary Cubans. And the word embargo was not a part, or blockade as they call it, was not a part of the political lexicon until the special period. And it's not surprising why it wasn't. When I went to Cuba the first time in 1977, it was the only time in the history of the revolution that things were getting better for Cubans because, of course, the Soviets allowed the Cubans to sell their sugar on the world market, which was way above the 32 cents subsidy they were getting from the Soviets. The world market price shot up in 1976 to about 56 cents per pound. So they got a windfall, and they invested it in the country at the time. And everybody thought the revolution had turned the corner, and things were going to be wonderful from then on. The 80s were tough years. So if you look at the revolution, every 10 years they've had really critical turning points. The 60s, of course, when they decided to go off agriculture and they didn't develop industry, created all these problems that they were later to try to adjust in the 70s and 80s under changing circumstances. First of all, not industrializing the country at the time meant that if you practice a policy of redistribution without creating a new cake, you can only do it once. And what succeeds is, of course, diminishing access to facilities, resources. The 70s, they became a conventional, subsidized Soviet state. And the 80s was a retreat from this under Gorbachev. But until the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Cubans didn't really feel this. But the 10 years, I think, between 1991 and 2001 were critical in Cuba, not the least of which the military, which came into power in 1980, because before that they were sort of out of political structure, not only took over the political control under Raúl, this is when Raúl really comes to the fore in Cuba, but they also took over the economy, and they restructured it and nominated it to have the present modified form of centralized economy that we have today, which they will have now to continue to change in ways which are really challenging to the state, the political system of the state, as well as the economic system of the state. The second thing, of course, is the economy. You've got to develop a productive economy that's self-sustaining, and Cuba hasn't done that yet. And that's a big challenge, irrespective of who's in charge, whether it is. I have said, and got in trouble for saying, the revolution ended in 1980. Said that in Jamaica, actually. Some representatives from the Cuban embassy did not take too kindly to that. We're still good friends, though. I still go to Cuba, and I still give my seminars there, and we talk about that, what it means to be, to have an ongoing revolution. And it means different things to different people at the time. But there are some big problems to be confronted. The transition to civil society, which has to be continued and expanded in Cuba. And it's really difficult to see how they do that with the centralized control of the economy that exists today. I think there are other aspects of it. There are particular problems with the United States. The question of Guantanamo, which is a violation of international law, as well as a violation of the bilateral treaty that established it. Not to mention that the 100 years since 1902 has long passed. So the U.S. shouldn't be in Guantanamo. There's a question of what to do with property confiscated by the Cubans after 1960, and how the compensation will be adjusted for that. It is erroneous to think that the Castro Revolution confiscated all private property. It did not. In fact, a substantial proportion of Cuban real estate still remains in private hands. And one might remember that the Association of Small Farmers, ANA, is largely a private concern. And it is this small group, actually, that wrought a revolution in agriculture between 1994 and 1996 that brought Cubans back into eating well and getting the type of things that state farms could not support. So we can go into a lot of individual issues that can be and must be resolved in the next few years. And the question is, who and how will these things be, who will resolve them and how will they be resolved?
Thank you very much. A lot of issues there to deal with. As Ambassador Bernal said at the beginning, it is very hard, actually impossible. Not even a Fidel Castro-led speech in terms of the time could have us do justice to all of these issues this morning. But we do want to hear some questions from the audience. Before I invite audience members to just raise your hand, indicate where you are, and a microphone will be found. But before that, in the audience we have Ambassador Felix, who is here, who is Jamaica's ambassador to Cuba from 2004 to 2008. And I'm going to slightly embarrass her twice. The first embarrassment is to remind her that I met her in Cuba. We are on the same flight from Jamaica to Cuba once, and we met there. And she was very helpful to me when I got to Cuba and helping me get acquainted. And second slight embarrassment is to ask her if she wouldn't mind offering a few remarks from your perspective on Fidel Castro and Cuba.
Thank you. Well, putting me on the spot. But I have to say that, my experience in Cuba was really phenomenal. I was in the Foreign Service in protocol, and then I was asked if I would be interested in serving in Cuba. And I was, because they had a large student population. And as a former teacher, I just love the students. And then we also had quite a high level of prisoners in Cuba too. And I had thought that that wouldn't have been an area that was focused, but it became an area of focus because I was impressed with how the prisoners were treated in Cuba. And we did have delegations from Jamaica that came when I was there to look at the Cuban system and how they treated. And I found they respected their rights. I could have a meeting with them like this. They brought them in, no handcuff, and I was able to visit the prisoners every month. And so I was impressed with that. And then the Jamaican descendant population that was also there, and that they have their strict they retain their bonds to Jamaica. And so I was involved in that community too. And then it was the exposure to President Fidel and the writings, his speeches that were really inspirational. And to see how that his vision was able to impact the Cuban people. So, and how much they did with the little that they had, and how much they were prepared to share with the little that they had, and extended the generosity to our own students and to any situation that we had in Jamaica. And so that impressed me. And then in particular their medical, the doctors, the Cuban doctors, and I benefited myself because it was in Cuba that I discovered that I had cancer, and I received all my treatment in Cuba, and I'm still here today.
Thank you very much. Okay, we now move to questions. I ask you, raise your hand, you'll be identified, and please state your name for the purposes of the recording when you, before asking your question and who your question is directed to. And I'm asking for brief questions because I know we are going a little bit long here, but we do want to take a few questions from the audience. So.
Good morning, I'm Hilary Robertson Hickling. I will make very brief remarks. I am concerned about our having a discussion across generations. I teach here at UWI and I've been discussing various things with the students in the Mona School of Business and Management. And I think the importance of information about the past is a problem that we have. I thought this room was going to be full and running over. I know people are having exams, and I had to come late because my husband is in the hospital this morning. Anyway, I think though that the discussion has to go to the new generation and looking forward. How are we going to do that? I want to say that I became involved with the Cuba Friendship Association, I think in 1976, and there was a great foment in our country and an idea that things could change. I believe that in this time there's a great deal of cynicism and despondency and a sense of hopelessness among the generation. And I think that that is going to be something that the need for this inspiration and new ideas about revolution and so on are necessary. So the last point I want to make was, when Castro said, somos Latin Africanos, I had never thought about this idea. And I think the entire issue around Cuba and Africa, very important. I was in South Africa 2 weeks ago. And so I recognize again how important what happened to Cuba in Quito Carnivale, for example. A lot of people don't know anything about that era when the Cubans defeated the South African army. And so there's a lot of information that is missing in people's understanding of things. The people from Africa, Southern Africa, know this, but the people in our world don't know this. And so I think that, I don't know who is going to do the work of building this bridge across generations. Perhaps it's the organizers of this morning, I don't know. But I think it's a very important work that has to be done.
Thank you.
And that's what I'd like to say.
Thank you very much. Dr. and Professor Duncan.
Okay, I'm Neville Duncan, a former lecturer here at UWI, retired. And I am part of the older generation at age 72. And I have written publicly on the web on Cuba. One particular article I looked back on during the search was Cuba changes mood and direction. And this was back in the mid-75 onwards. In fact, at that point in time, Professor McKnight, at that point in time, a number of new things happened. The amazing action by President Fidel Castro at the time of changing a significant proportion of his political managers so that they were drawn only from people under the age of 30. This is obviously a significant attempt by a revolutionary leader to change the character and tone of his administration, and made a big difference. I mean, I remember people like Ambassador Robaina, and I remember Rodriguez was put in charge of economic and financial management of the economy, bringing new non-socialist ideas essentially to bear on Cuban development. It was facing serious challenges. And all of these things are amazing for someone deemed a socialist revolutionary to make that kind of move. In Jamaica, we find our older leaders don't want to move. But the point is that basically Cuba understood that it had to evolve and its role is changing. The other aspect that struck me under Fidel Castro was basically CARICOM, the relationship between CARICOM and Cuba. CARICOM entered the Summit of Americas without insisting in the strongest possible terms about Cuban participation. I found that a sadness, a deep sadness, that you can have a Summit of the Americas held frequently in Miami to change the nature of U.S.-Latin American relationship without the presence of Cuba, right? And basically, I felt saddened by that. But indeed, Cuba-CARICOM relationship was always surprisingly good and decent in lots of other ways. But I thought permitting USA to have its way in the Summit of Americas, which fortunately collapsed, I suppose because of that deficiency, was a good thing.
Yes, thank you, Professor Duncan.
If I could just...
Okay, I think Ambassador Bernal has a comment related to that.
I suspect it's the same comment.
Thank you. I was involved in the Summit of the Americas from the very beginning in all the negotiations, and I attended the first 3 summits. The Caribbean protested at every stage about the exclusion of Cuba. We did not, as a group, go as far as saying we would not attend the summit. But short of that, we did everything possible. I can well recall that all the speeches made by the Caribbean prime ministers and presidents made reference to the absence of Cuba. And this extended into the OAS. And when the OAS ceased to endorse the embargo, it was the Caribbean played a leading role in this. It's just a nuanced interpretation.
Thank you. Dr. Anderson had her hand up earlier.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. One is, what were those penalties that we suffered? Moji Anderson in the sociology department here. What were those penalties that Jamaica suffered as a result of our support for Cuba's intervention in Southern Africa? Ambassador Heaven, you had mentioned it. And the second was, what do you think will be the effect of this so-called normalization of relations with the U.S.? I personally am very worried, but I'd like to know what you guys think will be the outcome of the normalization.
Is the question, what was the consequence of our
Yes, well, penalties.
Yeah, you said that there were that we suffered penalties as a result of our support for Cuba's intervention in Southern Africa.
Well, I think that the consequence manifested itself in two arenas. One was our own domestic politics, and secondly was the relationship between ourselves and the United States. On the domestic scene, looking around the room, I don't know how many people were old enough to remember that particular era and what was unleashed on the country, some of which was internally generated and some of it received external assistance in creating a great deal of uncertainty, confusion, and I'll give you an example. There was a dream by the leader of the government at the time to be able to extract more from bauxite and alumina than we were getting. And I think that's very important, particularly what you raised, Dr. Hickton, about the need to be able to transmit the facts behind some of these things as to why the attempts that were made, legitimate attempts, were thwarted. I remember Jamaica was at the forefront of instituting the equivalent of the oil producers for bauxite and alumina. And the attempts to which that was killed initially. And any attempt that was made to be able to earn more money from the manufacture of aluminium as opposed to just dealing with bauxite and to some extent alumina was thwarted. And a number of areas of activity that hitherto we enjoyed some benefits were cut off. But I think most importantly was the level of instability that was created internally, that was orchestrated from outside. And I'm not suggesting that everything that happened was local, but there was a level of orchestration which fueled the era and created a great deal of confusion in the country as to where we were going at the time. And my suspicion is that we were warned by the United States. When Dr. Kissinger came to Jamaica, and I didn't want to call names, but when he came to Jamaica and took up residence down in Ocherios and demanded that the then Prime Minister come down there to speak with him. He didn't go, but instead suggested that he came to Jamaica House, which he did. And in no uncertain manner, he told Mr. Manley what was going to happen to him if he did not refrain from giving the political support to the Cubans in Southern Africa. Bear in mind that the South African forces in going into Angola did so with the backing of the United States. And we subsequently remember, those of us who can, the role of Jonas Savimbi, and who sponsored Savimbi to try to destabilize what was happening. So it meant a lot. We need to remember Mrs. Thatcher's expressions about Mandela, that he should be hung. All these things took place at that time. Conveniently, some of us pretend as if they didn't happen. So that there was a lot of things going on behind the scenes which sought to destabilize us for being bold enough at the time to defy the dictates of our big neighbor to the north in seeking to give Fidel the political support he needed internationally. And some of us might not understand how important a role Jamaica played in giving that political support that he needed to be able to overcome. Significantly, talking about going forward, the Europeans and the Canadians, and I suppose Ambassador Bernal can give stories about what happened with the negotiations with CARIFORUM. They want Cuba to be part of the Caribbean, because when you're dealing with a trade negotiation, reciprocity is important, and all 5 million of us English-speaking people feel that we are an important entity. As far as they are concerned, dealing with us is not a priority as it would be dealing with an entity that has Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Haiti. Then, get to a size where you can meaningfully have discussions on trade. And I think it is very important that we understand the role of all of this going forward, and why it is very important, for example, for us to understand why Brexit is going to be so important to us, and why we need to strengthen our capacity to be able to now deal with the Europeans with whom we have a signed and sealed contract, and a new entity called the United Kingdom with whom we are going to have to now negotiate with, who hitherto we depended on to be part of our voice in Europe. And so there's a whole lot of shifting going on, and we need to objectively sit down, forget the prejudices, and see what is best for us, a small little country, and how we are going to avoid the repercussions.
Thank you. Mr. Moxon, you had your hand up.
Morning, Earl Moxon, RJR Group. Two quick questions. One for Professor Knight. My grandfather, who was born in 1896, when I was a child, he used to tell me of narrowly escaping being shot down in a cane field in Cuba because he was part of a group of angry Jamaican sugar workers who were not satisfied with the treatment they were receiving. I don't know if you can put that particular period in context for us, because obviously that would eventually have been part of what led to the Cuban Revolution in terms of the treatment of the ordinary people. Professor Heaven, Ambassador Heaven, in respect of Jamaica, there is a criticism I've heard from time to time that some who benefited most from the initiatives of the 1970s, some of them in collaboration with Cuban support, that they have not lived up to the ideals of those initiatives and the benefit that they received. I wonder if you would comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Knight can respond.
Yes. Well, the reconstruction of the Cuban sugar industry after 1900 was largely done on the back of British West Indians, mainly Jamaicans and Haitians, and largely in the center and eastern part of Cuba, which was new to the Cuban sugar industry. United Fruit, in fact, Fidel Castro's father, is part of the expansion of the Cuban sugar industry in that part of the island. And in 1980, I did a research project which involved actually talking to some of these people who went, because they were in their 80s at the time. And I went all across Cuba. I found about 30 between the ages of 77 and 83 who are still alive and could communicate. There were some who were alive but just couldn't follow a conversation. And yes, they had interesting stories to tell. And there is a book out, just out actually, an interesting book by a Barbadian woman, a descendant of one of these Barbadians who went, I think it's called Tell Me Mother, A Done Gone to Cuba or something to that effect. But there are two things about that migration, apart from the fact that it was crucial in reestablishing the Cuban sugar industry, is that there was a very big difference between British West Indians and Haitians. British West Indians always had some type of diplomatic support from the British consul. Not always wholeheartedly, but they always insisted they were British subjects. And in Cuba they are called ingleses because of their language, but also because of their political commitment. And their conditions tended to be slightly better than the Haitians because the Haitians did not have the same caliber of political representation. And this was a handicap in Cuba at the time. You have to remember that Cuba between 1902 and 1959 is a political system with a contested legitimacy, even from the very beginning, because it is under the hegemonial control of the United States. The United States went in 1906, 1909, 1913, 1917, 1929, and 30 to restore the political system. So it was a really weak political system, and we don't have time to go into that. But what it did not do is represent well the people it was responsible for. And that is one of the achievements of the revolution. A lot of Jamaicans stayed on in Cuba. I think there are something like 20,000 still claim descendants, and you can see it in the names. You run into them all over Cuba, some Hispanized, some didn't. I had family who went to, my mother's two brothers went to Cuba, I think in the 30s, and worked until they were kicked out in 31 when they changed the law to restrict employment or to give preference to Cubans in employment in Cuba. But that's an interesting story, and it has established actually a link with Cuba as strong as the link with Panama that you can find in running across Jamaica and speaking to Jamaican families. I am astonished all the time when I am in Jamaica running into someone who has a connection to Cuba, Costa Rica, or Panama. And it's much more common than I anticipated.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Yes, your observation is correct to some extent. The vast majority of the persons who had the experience have regarded the experience in a positive way, and they have in fact in their own quiet way been making a contribution to try to effect some change in Jamaica. People being what they are, however, it is not surprising that having returned to a situation that is entirely different from the exposure that they had there would have reverted to some of the ways in which they think they need to revert in order to survive. So I believe that if one should be able to do a poll among the persons who had the opportunity and the benefits, you would find that they would react in a very positive way to their exposures. But the fact that some people may have not taken advantage, as doctors have, as we would have expected a lot of them to, and some of them may have reverted to some of their old habits, cannot be viewed as a failure. There is a significant positive that has happened, that the people who have had the opportunity of the exposure have benefited from and have been able to allow the country to benefit from that as well.
Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, Vice-Chancellor, who is with us now and will be offering summations shortly. Welcome, Professor. We have about time for maybe 2 more questions, if anybody has a question that they'd like to ask before we turn things to the Vice-Chancellor. Professor Figueroa.
Hello, I'm Mark Figueroa. Apologize, I'm not going to ask a question. I'm going to say something. I think that, first of all, I wanted to clarify a point which I think is important, is Cuba in the 60s and Jamaica's relationship with them. Because I think, as Derrick has said, there's some amount of division on Cuba and some amount of reconciliation, so that making a statement about that is important. One of the things that is important about the post-independence Jamaica is Jamaica refused to cut off ties with Cuba. It refused to close down its consulate in Cuba, which it was under severe pressure from the United States to do so, and that it insisted that because of the heritage issues which Frank has been talking to and others have spoken about, that they could not break off ties with Cuba. In addition to which, of course, it must be noted that there were people who were moved by the Cuban Revolution and who, for example, attended the Tricontinental Conference in the personality of George Beckford and others, and who suffered from doing so in that they had their passports taken away from them. And it was an issue here at UWI in that UWI was engaged in the regional studies at ISA, the predecessor of SADISAS, where I am not, undertaking these regional studies about regional integration funded by the Caribbean governments, and they declined to take any further money from the Jamaican government on the grounds that Leroy Taylor and George Beckford, who had gone to the Tricontinental Conference, had their passports removed. Very briefly, I think that I disagree that the CIA has been entirely poor in its work. I think they've done some great work along the lines that they do their job. And I think that knowing your enemy is important. One of the important difficulties the U.S. had in South Africa is that they completely misread the Cubans, and they've always completely misread the Cubans, because they thought the Cubans went into Africa as a Soviet surrogate. But the Cubans went into South Africa without telling the Soviets they were going in, and against what the Soviets wanted them to do, because the Soviets were trying to build rapprochement with the U.S. at the time. And one of the things, just to give the character of the man Fidel, and there's a very important book which is called Visions of Freedom, which I would advise everyone to read to get the character of Fidel. What Fidel did to defeat the South Africans, he knew that if he asked the Soviets for air support in Southern Africa, they wouldn't give him. But what he did, he dismantled the anti-aircraft weapons in Cuba, leaving Cuba open to attack from Reagan, which he thought might happen. And he shipped those anti-aircraft equipment to Angola. And that is how they defeated the South Africans, because the South Africans could not use their air force there. So that gives the character of the man. I think the question of Jamaicans receiving military training in Cuba, just as Jamaicans receive military training from the CIA and in the U.S., at another time we'll have to discuss that. But I think that was a separate issue from the brigadistas, and there's some confusion there. But we can't deny that Jamaicans received military training in Cuba during the height of the Cold War period. So, but that is another story which will have to come up another time. But I think going forward and Cuba's future, there's an issue of reconciliation that you wonder how it's going to come about. And there's a difficulty which Cuba faces, is how do you transition into a new era? And we see what happened in Eastern Europe. We have seen what has happened in Russia in particular.
and the very negative transition that has taken place, that state property has simply been privatized in the worst possible way. So that I think the Cuban Revolution is struggling with this issue as to how do you move in a different period. And I think that the Cuban Revolution must be given a lot of benefits for its growth. And one of the issues on which it has grown is the issue of the position of sexual orientation. I mean, the treatment of persons with same-sex orientation in Cuba was particularly harsh during the early years of the revolution. But Cuba is now ahead of the rest of the Caribbean on this issue at this time. So I think the Cuban Revolution must be given a chance to grow and so forth. And the other thing that has been mentioned is that Cuba in 2006 was recognized by the World Wildlife Foundation as the only country in the world that was living within its environmental footprint and at the same time had a high human development index. And this was done based on what was said about the initiative of the peasant farmers along with the research institutes, which is something the Vice Chancellor might take note of, the link between the research institutes and the peasant farmers in developing the agroecological production, which is based on sustainable agriculture. I think the last thing I would say relates to reconciliation, and I think that one of the things, of course, it was great to see Prime Minister Andrew Holness on the Diaz with Prime Minister, next to Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves and the others. But I think that we'd like to get the point in Jamaica where, as in the case of the Indian delegation, the Indian delegation to that affair was a joint party delegation. You didn't have two separate delegations, one from the opposition and one from the government. But I would like to see the point where when we understand the interest of our country and the role of a two-party system of the government and the opposition, that we don't go down the line of the United States where we're becoming increasingly polarized, but we move to where an increases consensus on important issues like Cuba and Fidel Castro, where the Prime Minister would include in his delegation the leader of the opposition or some other representative of the opposition. Sorry for so long,
No,
but
that's
thank you
fine.
very much.
Thank you very much for that intervention, Mark. Final comment before we turn things to VC from Ambassador Bernal.
I'll be brief. One of the things we haven't touched on, which I think is important, is the psychological importance of Cuba, its existence, and the policies it pursued. When you're from a small developing country, your ambitions to pursue self-determination, your sovereignty is seriously constrained and impinged upon every day by larger countries, particularly one country in this hemisphere. And the fact that Cuba was able to resist and to survive severe pressure was inspirational to other countries who may not have been able to do it to the same extent, but it was psychologically important because it demonstrated the possibility of self-determination in a greater degree than some small states were able to. But on the other hand as well, psychologically, the fact that Cuba was able to survive and resist U.S. pressure also had an important psychological effect in the United States. If you have a small country in what you regard as your domain that has resisted you for 50 or 60 years, it begins to create doubts in the minds of those in power as to just how powerful they are, and the fact that some of the means they have at their disposal could not be applied. For example, you don't go and drop a nuclear bomb. You couldn't apply certain things. So the psychological importance of the Cuban Revolution is very important.
Thank you.
Just one comment, if I would be permitted. there was an institution that was established during the height of the relationship between both our countries, and that's CARIFESTA, and the important role it played in allowing us to understand each other. And I was very disappointed when that was terminated, and it brought about an understanding among us in the Caribbean about each other that has since not developed to the extent that it should, and the impact that it would have had in seeking to move away this discussion from being influenced by partisan outlook. And it's very important, as was said earlier, that if we're going to move this discussion to its rightful place, that it be done in a manner that is devoid of the subjectivity of political partisanship to the level of objectivity that is going to allow us to really be able to see the benefits of the relationship that is now going to happen. Whether we like it or not, it is going to happen.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Heaven. That was a very useful intervention from everyone. Thanks to everyone for their participation. You know, it's very clear, I think we made this point at the outset, that it was impossible really to cover all the issues. And I'm hoping that in the future we could have another sort of forum where we can discuss issues relative to Fidel Castro, Cuba, and the Caribbean Union. There's so many more issues to put on the table: the issue of psychology, the issue of culture, Cuba's immense impact on Caribbean culture and CARIFESTA, but also just other festivals that Cuba had regularly, which not only brought Caribbean people from different islands to Cuba, but also brought Africans and other artists to Cuba as well, and led to that a deep sort of exchange. Lots of issues left to deal with this, but I think this has been a very, very fruitful and rich discussion, and I thank all the panelists for their contributions as well as members of the audience. It now is great pleasure to turn things over to the Vice-Chancellor for his closing summation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and panelists and friends, colleagues, my great distinguished mentor and friend, Professor Knight. Good to see you. Very good morning, everyone. This is not so much a summary, but an intervention from a historian reflecting upon all of this. I should begin with the subjective and the personal. I have had the opportunity to meet Comrade Fidel on 3 or 4 occasions and to have developed a kind of conversation with him. In 2001, at the UN Conference on Race and Intolerances in Durban, South Africa, I was leading the Barbados delegation, and we were seated alphabetically, and I was sandwiched between Arafat and Castro. And for 3 days, I was whispering to the left and to the right, not ideologically, but conversations between Arafat and Fidel over those 3 days, and it was most extraordinary. And one of the issues I raised with him was the issue of personal reparations, because as you've heard, many folks from the English-speaking territories did work through the plantation system. My great-grandfather went to Cuba to work for the fruit company on the sugar plantation, and as was the norm, he, at the end of his contract, did not return and went underground and lived in Havana. And there was a large
Caribbean community that had broken their contracts and had not returned to their countries after their contracts, and were living in Havana, and many of these were deported in 1961 during the moral cleansing process. And my great-grandfather was one of those who was put on a boat and sent back to Barbados. And I was maybe 6 years old, but I recall this man returning to the household speaking Spanish and penniless, because after 8 years he had been deported. And I said to Comrade Fidel, my great-grandfather had properties in Havana, and I would like some compensation for the appropriation of these properties by the state. And he said, yes, no, you send me the inventory and I will see to it. But most seriously, what was clear to me is that Fidel Castro is, and will be quintessentially a Caribbean person. I think we need to emphasize that because Professor Knight has been saying to us in his speeches, in his writing for 40 years, that this is a Caribbean story. This is at the heart of what it is to be Caribbean. This is quintessentially Caribbean. Yes, there is that discourse about Latin America and so on, and an attempt to subsume it in that space. But this is a Caribbean story from the very beginning. And this is a Caribbean revolution. This is a Caribbean leader and a Caribbean icon. And it's rooted in the logic of Caribbean history. Now, that logic would be that the Caribbean has, in its modern formation, was at the center of what became known as the West. And that is interesting because if the plantation system and the colonization system of the Caribbean that became the amphitheater of the rise of the West in its trade and ideological formation, Fidel was clear that the Cuban Revolution was therefore a Western revolution, and that had tremendous significance for the ideological interpretation of what was going on there and then. So the Caribbean is a contested space. It was a space that was possessed and owned. Not only the territories, but the people in these islands were possessed and owned. So the issue of ownership and of possession by external agencies is at the heart of what became known as the Caribbean Revolution. And I think the historians have constructed the empirical footprint to show that from the very beginning of colonization, from the Columbus moment through what has been taking place in the Caribbean is one protracted, ongoing Caribbean revolution against possession, against ownership, and to determine the direction of these spaces by the people who live in them. And this has been a grinding, ongoing process. And therefore the Cuban Revolution is just one of many moments along this trajectory. But the intensity for self-possession, self-determination, self-ownership, of course, these are the issues at the heart of the Cuban Revolution. And I think Eric Williams was quite correct when he wrote his book on the history of the Caribbean to frame it in the context from Toussaint Louverture to Fidel. And he was quite correct to frame it in that context because he was making the point that it was a long revolution. And he bookmarked or ended with Toussaint that this was the beginning of what he called the Caribbean Enlightenment. And the Caribbean Enlightenment is the counter-revolution because in the Western Enlightenment that we all know about, that Western Enlightenment produced slavery. And the question was, how could an Enlightenment produce slavery? But that is what we were told as the Western Enlightenment of the 16th, 17th centuries. In its manifestation, it produced colonization, racism, and all of these other issues. Now, the way in which that was resolved was to say, well, no, this Enlightenment does not include these people. because these people are the other, and therefore that was the frame of that. So the Caribbean Revolution is the antithesis in many ways of all of that, and Toussaint. And Matthew, you might be able to tell me, that wonderful poem written by William Wordsworth in celebration of Toussaint.
On the common wind.
The Common Wind is a beautiful poem in which Toussaint is constructed as now the epitome of what the Western Enlightenment should have been. And Eric Williams carried that through to Fidel Castro as an Enlightenment figure, the Caribbean Enlightenment working its way through. But what is important, I believe, about the 1959 through to 1969 is that while the Caribbean Revolution was taking place in Cuba, the leaders of all of the English-speaking colonies at the same time, they all possess one fear. If we took independence to a referendum, the people of the English-speaking Caribbean would vote against independence. So no premier went to a referendum. Eric Williams was afraid of the referendum. Norman Manley, Bustamante, Barrow, Burnham, they were all afraid to put independence to referendum because they felt that the depth of the colonizing force was so powerful that the majority of people would say, no, let us stay colonial. And they all said it. They all said, no referendum, we will lose. You do not go to referendum if you know the result. And if you think. So they all pushed through independence without referenda. Meanwhile, next door, the revolution is kicking. And then we have this Caribbean where the masses of people are rising up in one place to possess their space, to own it, to possess, to take control. And in the surrounding spaces, there was trepidation about the possibility of that. And that becomes the contradiction that existed in the region. But that contradiction existed also, of course, within each society. So it is important, I believe, to compare and contrast the independence models that we all pushed through at the same time that next door this revolution was taking place, and the different models in terms of how to approach. When I reflect as an academic and remembering some of my own professors who spoke about the Russian Revolution especially, I was always struck by the argument that revolutions are not meant to be long-term sustaining restructuring processes, that fundamentally they are at their best when they resolve problems at a moment, correct those issues, and then move on. And there was one of my professors who would say, listen, don't imagine the Russian Revolution as any long-term process. Here is a relatively backward European state that is left behind by Western Europe. And there is a desire to take these people and their economy and society forward, and that the market economy could not do it. So the revolution was designed to mobilize all of the resources available by the state with all the tyrannies and so on, and to take a medieval economy and society, move it 100 years in 20 years. And when that is complete, then you will see the revolution will be abandoned. And this was a consistent view within the historiography of that revolution. That yes, one moment Russia was a backward peasant economy, and the next moment it was sending men into space with the most advanced technology. And that was done in 30 years. In 30 years they were able to do all of that, with all the human suffering that we associate Stalin with. But you crunch history in a short period of time into a circumstance. Now, crunching of time is important And there is no doubt that what took place in Cuba was a time crunching, all revolutions. You move a people forward 50 years in 10 years. You move them forward 100 years in 20 years. And this is what these things tend to achieve. And the question we have to ask then is this. Are the Cuban people today more prepared for the 21st century than they would have been otherwise? I believe that looking at this 21st century and all of the issues that are facing it, and that we could very well imagine, I believe that the Cuban people might very well be the most prepared citizens in this region for this century. And notwithstanding how the governance model works out, notwithstanding how the restructuring of governance will take place in the next 5-10 years, notwithstanding all of the reforms of structure, administration, political governance, and so on, the citizens themselves, through their consciousness and their human resource development, are they prepared for this 21st century. And I think that when we conduct that analysis, I think we will find that looking into the future, small island developing states preparing for this global moment in human history, I think we will find that the Cuban people are arguably the most prepared Caribbean peoples for this 21st century. I thank you.
It's unusual when you open the batting that you carry your bat right through the innings, but I've been assigned to close off this remarkable start. This is just a start to our discussion. What a wonderful start. First of all, I'd like to thank Don Rojas, who put this together very quickly, and very importantly, is beaming this live out to a much wider audience. One of the concerns that emerged here is that the younger generation, my generation, don't know enough about these events. But once it's there in this form live, and it will be shown again, it's on the internet, will go some way in enlightening my generation about these events. I'd like to thank the panelists. We were most fortunate, as I said at the beginning. We have a really erudite panel. In particular, I'd like to thank Professor Franklin Knight, whose long connection with the university here. He truly is emblematic of the public intellectual. He's always available to share his encyclopedic knowledge. So we thank you. It would have been nice to have you here in person so that you could give us one of your anecdotes about rums of the Caribbean, but we will save that libation for a suitable occasion. Ambassador and High Commissioner, at the beginning, we're friends, and he's going to reprimand me because I'm going to repeat this when I said that he is one of the most astute diplomats I have met, and I have some familiarity with the territory. You're very insightful. You owe us a lot more of this history. You are a little coy in keeping certain things confidential, but we need to get all of this down for posterity. One of the things that Dr. McFarlane was able to bring across to us is the decency and receptivity of the Cuban people to people from all over the world, and sharing their limited resources generously, and the lessons that have been derived. You enumerated a number of them, and although Ambassador Heaven admits that some of those who had the exposure have fallen by the way, reverted to old cultures, I still was very impressed with your remarks. I'm so happy you're able to join us. I know the future of teaching history and researching here at the university is in good hands with Professor Matthew Smith. He owes us a seminar like this on Haiti, but you were most adept in managing and bringing everybody into the conversation. At the very beginning, I said I hoped we would have Sir Hilary with us, and I advised you that our hope was based on the fact that he always has insightful connections and insightful remarks, and today he maintained his reputation. All of you were here and added considerably to the conversation. There were more in-depth comments than questions, and it shows that the knowledge that was shared today is also embedded in you. There's a lot more. That's why I said this is just the start. Ambassador Felix, you are good enough to share your experiences, including a personal one, that you received treatment, medical treatment for a potentially terminal condition in Cuba, free. And that is what Guevara means when he says a true revolutionary is motivated by love, the sheer humanity. And I share, to close, a personal anecdote just to show you the humanity that Fidel has infused and brought out of the Cuban people. My wife and I were in Cuba. I worked for an institution in which Cuba was a member, and Cuba attended all the meetings, paid on time, which cannot be said for all the member states. So I went there regularly. We were there and we wanted to see an exhibition by Wilfredo Lam. So we had been treated royally. We had a driver, a protocol officer, and so on. So we broke all the rules and we turned up at this thing. Downstairs, everybody was literally standing at attention. Upstairs was President Fidel Castro, the wife of the late artist, and the curator. When we came, Fidel's assistant recognized me from the meeting of the morning before. He said, "Come upstairs," you know. When we went upstairs, there was just three of them. And Fidel had a bad leg, so when I came, he was not only recognized me, but he saw a useful means of support. So he put his arms around me and leaned on me, and for the next hour, we discussed in this small group the Caribbean and the importance of culture. But to me, that brought out, there are very few world leaders you would meet who their humanity matches their public persona. What I'm trying to say is that Fidel Castro is a real, genuine humanist revolutionary. What Che Guevara meant by a revolutionary. So we've just started the discussion. To enable us to continue this with access to the panelists and to share some more views, we're inviting you to join us outside for some light refreshment where we can continue the dialogue. Once again, thanks to all for what has been a wonderfully rewarding start to the discussion.